Now that we've spent a little bit of time considering the key elements of inquiry-based labs and how they can align with evidence-based teaching practices, we're going to spend some time considering ways that you can assess how well your inquiry-based lab is meeting your learning goals. As with any course, you'll want to begin by considering the key features of backwards design. First, consider what you want your students to learn. Then, think about the type of evidence that will let you know how well they learn that, how well they meet those learning objectives. And then, let those decisions guide what it is you have your students do. In other words, start by identifying your learning goals and objectives, then use those to drive your assessments, and let decisions about those two determine what activities you have your students do. In this video, we're going to focus on the first two parts of backwards design. We're going to be considering how you can design or choose assessments that align well with learning objectives that are common in inquiry-based labs. We're going to start with some examples of graded summative assessments that are used in the examples of inquiry-based labs that we considered earlier, both from the Astronomy Inquiry-Based Lab and the Biological Sciences Inquiry-Based Lab. Then, I'm going to share with you some examples of assessments that wouldn't necessarily be used to grade student work, to determine student grades, but that can be used in an evaluation of how well students in the lab are meeting your learning objectives. So let's start with hearing some examples of graded summative assignments that are used in those examples of inquiry-based labs that we looked at earlier.
Our overall goal in the course is to try to engage the students in becoming better thinkers through involvement in the research process. So in particular, we are trying to get them to figure out how to look for answers, how to determine whether what they have found is trustworthy, and to practice communicating what they've discovered and how to write up their conclusions. So within these larger goals, we have more specific objectives relating to communication. So we are trying to assess this particular objective through sessions that we have in the middle of the semester and also at the end of the semester. This involves doing a PowerPoint presentation to present the results of their work, and also a poster session and a paper write-up at the end of the semester. So at the mid-semester point, the students each group of students does an 8 to 10 minute presentation, and in that presentation they talk about what their goals are, their preliminary results, and any data analysis that they've done up to that point. So this is really important in the class because it's one of the main ways that the other groups in the class get to learn what the groups that they aren't involved in are doing. So they're evaluated at that point, and we have a rubric that is given to the students, and then each of the teaching personnel in the class fills out an evaluation for the group after each one of the presentations. Then the group mentor looks at those to try to arrive at a more objective way to get a grade for that presentation. At the end of the semester, then, each group writes a paper, and they also produce a poster. The poster is presented at a poster session that's held in the lobby of our building, and the public is invited, so a lot of the faculty will come down and see what the students have done. So the students are basically held accountable for being able to explain what happened, explain what their results mean, and in this case it's a much more one-on-one sort of experience where they interact with the questioners during the poster session. So each student, as well as each teaching personnel, goes around and fills out an evaluation of the posters, And once again, the TAs use those as a means for determining the grade that they're going to get on the poster.
So in my astronomy lab, my goal is to have the students be able to make an evidence-based conclusion from data. And that data can be collected on the internet. It can be collected from their own personal experience, but we have them collected on the internet. And so they have to be able to ask an answerable research question, be able to gather evidence to answer that question, and then make a conclusion from that evidence. So those are like my big 3 main learning goals. The assessment that I have the students do is that they have to actually do the process, and they are supported in doing that beforehand. They first have to go through looking at evidence. They have to look at some conclusions and evaluate how those conclusions, do they match the evidence? They have to look at some data and make their own conclusions. And then they have to actually go through the whole process themselves. And that process, actually, the process of going through it themselves actually only really takes about 20 minutes for them to generate an answerable research question, create a procedure, gather their data, and then make their evidence-based conclusion. That actually only takes about 20 minutes. There's about an hour beforehand of helping support them to get there. As an example, I have this particular exercise, and it's called Investigating the Hubble Ultra Deep Field and Galaxies. So the Hubble Ultra Deep Field is an image of a small piece of sky that has many, many galaxies in it. And so they have to kind of look at that picture, that image. It's an actual astronomical image, and they have to first gather some evidence. They have to look at it, then gather some evidence, and then they'll go on to make their research question using that image. So the thing that we first do is that they first are going to explore what's going on. So the exploration is just to look at the image and then first just look at the things that are in it. There are a few stars in the image, but most of the things are actually galaxies. And then they have to try and count how many galaxies, but you can't count all the galaxies in the universe, and so you only count a little piece. And so we're looking at different tools that astronomers use. We assume the universe is the same everywhere. And so that's one of the things that they're examining with this. So first they're looking just at what they see there. They're practicing evidence-based conclusions. They look a little bit more in depth. And then they start into phase 2, which, given some evidence that they gather themselves, and then they are given a conclusion, and they have to evaluate that conclusion. So they have to actually, in this process, they have to look at different galaxies in the image, and they have to draw them. And then a hypothetical conclusion was, are all the galaxies perfectly round, or are they slightly elongated? And then they have to explain their reasoning why they think that statement is true or false. So that's step 2, or phase 2. Then phase 3 is they are given a set of data. And so that's what this is. They're given a data table. And given that data table, what conclusions can they then draw? So they're practicing more and more. Then phase 4 is actually making a procedure, an appropriate procedure, a specific procedure as well. So that given an actual research question. They're given the research question. They don't have to create it themselves, but they have to create the procedure. Then phase 5, which is the big kahuna, that's the big thing that they're supposed to do, is to actually formulate the question. They have to get it okayed by a TA first, by the instructor first, and then they start gathering their actual data after they've made their procedure. Then they make their evidence-based conclusion. So that's like the big thing that we look at. The rubric that we use is actually entitled here, this Inquiry Self-Assessment Success Guide, and so it is exactly the same rubric that we use to assess them as they get to to assess themselves to make sure that they have a really great project. We look at the project and we look at the question and think, oh, how could somebody answer this? Then does the plan actually yield the evidence? Does the procedure yield, is it going to yield the evidence? Is it going to be specific enough? Can I actually recreate it? Recreate my students' data table, or kind of close enough, or something very, very similar. Then we look at how much evidence has been collected. Is it sufficient to actually answer their question? Because sometimes, it's really not sufficient. Then, but most of the time it is. The students are great about this. And then in their actual conclusion statement, are they claiming more than the evidence supports? We don't want them to make huge, grandiose statements. We want them to make statements that are reasonable for the evidence they have actually collected. So then looking at assumptions, because sometimes an assumption is good. Like, we assume the universe is the same everywhere. That's a good assumption to make. But they can't assume, things like that all nearby galaxies are yellow. So, yeah. And then, do they actually answer the question? This is something that not every researcher actually even does, is do they actually answer their research question? They could add more after that, but they do have to actually answer it in their conclusion. So that is how we actually assess this. Once the students have actually carried out a few different research projects and had a few different answerable research questions that they've generated and evidence-based conclusions, then we have them start looking at kind of bad research or incomplete research reports. There's parts of the research reports that are good and parts of the research reports that are lacking. And these would be mistakes commonly made by students. So we do find that by assessing other things, their reports do improve afterwards. After having done this, they are definitely better. Usually a few percentage points better after they've actually completed this. So they are asked different questions, and actually most of those questions are the same kinds of questions that we use on our grading rubric. Has more evidence been, is more evidence needed? Is the procedure actually a good procedure? Is it going to yield the evidence that you need? And then the students have to, just like look at it and circle and then start explaining. They are also asked to do a summary, which is, of course, a big overarching summary, looking at common problems to avoid in a research project, how to deal with assumptions, and then they have to summarize what makes a solid inquiry research project so that they can actually put that in words. They have to commit to something by actually putting it in words. Yes, we do assess them in their critique because we feel that the actual communication of what they learned is really, really important. We do mostly assess the summary. That's the biggest part of the assessment for that particular portion of the lab. And if they're able to communicate what makes a good project, then they are usually making really good projects after that.
So we just heard some nice examples of graded summative assignments that were used in the inquiry-based lab examples that we learned about earlier in this module. Sometimes we want to be able to measure students' progress toward our learning objectives, but we don't necessarily want to tie those assessments to the students' grades. In those cases, it can be nice to use tools that have been developed and validated by others for specifically such a purpose. Let's look at some examples of types of tools that might allow us to do this sort of thing. So one objective that is really common in inquiry-based labs is for students to be able to apply principles of experimental design to answer research questions. Now, you can design your own assessment to determine how well your students can meet this learning objective, and you can use that in either a graded or a non-graded way. However, there's a tool that's been developed by Karen Serum and Jennifer Humberg at Bowling Green State University that's particularly well developed for use in a non-graded system. So this is called the Experimental Design Ability Test, or the EDAT. And it's designed to be used in a pre-test, post-test fashion to determine how much your student's ability to apply principles of experimental design changes over the course of a class. So students are presented with a prompt in which they are asked to evaluate a claim, such as a claim that product X promotes outcome Y. The students provide a written description of the investigative design they would use to evaluate that claim, and it usually takes them about 10 to 12 minutes. The students' responses are evaluated using a 10-point rubric that's shown here. Each one of the lines on the rubric corresponds to a single point, and what you as the instructor do is you determine whether the student has completed that particular element, such as the recognition that an experiment can be done to test the claim, or the identification of which part in the investigation has to be held constant and which part can be varied, and so forth. The authors indicate that scoring is rapid, with 40 tests being able to be evaluated within 1 hour. They also indicate that inter-rater reliability is high and that students' performance on the EDAT is responsive to particular instruction. That is, if you really focus on increasing students' experimental design abilities, that the EDAT is effective in detecting that. Another type of learning goal that is really common in inquiry-based labs is for students to demonstrate an increase in scientific literacy. Now, I have this listed here as a learning goal rather than a learning objective because there are multiple skills that sort of fall within scientific literacy. If you're interested in the impact that your inquiry-based lab has on scientific literacy, then you might want to consider using the Test of Scientific Literacy Skills, or the TOSLS, a test that was developed by Kara Gormley, Peggy Brickman, and Mary Lutz. So this is a 28 multiple choice item test that is designed to be delivered in large courses and to be evaluated very rapidly. It measures 9 different skills that fall within scientific literacy, and these 9 skills fall within 2 categories. So the test determines students' ability to understand methods of inquiry that lead to scientific knowledge. And in that category, we have 4 different skills that the TOSLS evaluates. So students' ability to identify a valid scientific argument, their ability to evaluate the validity of sources, their ability to evaluate the use and misuse of scientific information, and their ability to understand elements of research design and how they impact scientific findings or conclusions. The other category has to do with organization, analysis, and interpretation of quantitative data and scientific information. And the skills within this category that are evaluated in this category have to do with students' ability to create graphical representations of data, their ability to read and interpret graphical representations of data, their ability to solve problems using quantitative skills, their ability to understand and interpret basic statistics, and their ability to justify inferences, predictions, and conclusions based on quantitative data. The test consists of 28 multiple choice items that are contextualized around real-world problems, such as the validity of scientific information on a website, or the validity of a claim about scientific information made within the popular literature. The authors provide a very careful description of the development of the test, and they focus significantly on the validity of the tool. That is, the tool's ability to really measure what it purports to measure. So the TOSLIS can be a tool to rapidly and reliably measure students' scientific literacy skills. And thus, if that's one of your goals in your inquiry-based lab, this might be a tool that you'd value using. Now, you may be interested in affective outcomes in your inquiry-based lab. That is, the impact of your inquiry-based lab on your students' attitudes about learning science or motivation to learn science. One of the best tools that's been developed to measure this type of learning goal is the Colorado Learning Attitudes About Science Survey, or the CLASS survey. This tool was developed by Wendy Adams, Kathy Perkins, Noah Podolewski, Mike Debson, Noah Finkelstein, and Carl Wyman at the University of Colorado Boulder, specifically to measure students' attitudes about learning physics. The survey is designed to be completed in about 10 minutes, and it consists of 42 items in which students' responses are characterized as either expert-like or novice-like within 8 categories, including personal interest, real-world connections, problem-solving sophistication, and problem-solving confidence. The authors carefully described the development of the tool, including how these categories were determined and how the authors evaluated the validity and the reliability of their survey in papers that are available on the University of Colorado Boulder website. Now, although the survey was developed to assess students' attitudes about learning physics, it has been adapted for chemistry, biology, astronomy, and math. And so that expands the disciplines in which this survey might be useful. So, if you're interested in evaluating outcomes in the affective domain, the CLASS survey is a tool that you might consider using. Now, we've tried to present some good examples of assessment instruments that you might use in a way that's not linked to grades. And although we think that these are 3 great examples, they're certainly not the only ones. There are many others. So some other places you might look for assessment instruments that would be good matches for your learning goals and objectives are in your favorite discipline-based education research journal, or at the Field-Tested Learning Assessment Guide, or FLAG Guide, which is found at flagguide.org. This provides a nice compendium of different assessment tools that have been developed. The Science Education Initiative at the University of Colorado Boulder also provides a nice repository of assessment instruments, as does the Carl Wyman Science Education Initiative at the University of British Columbia. So investigating these sources may unearth for you some assessment instruments that could be that you could use to assess your students' movement toward your learning objectives. So we've tried to present you some good examples of graded assessments that can be used to determine how well your students are meeting your learning objectives, or assessments that can be used to determine students' progress toward your learning goals, but not in a graded way. But the take-home message here is not that these are the very best tools or these are the right tools to use, but instead that what's really important is to start by identifying what it is you want your students to learn and then either design or develop assessments that will really let you determine how well students are moving toward those learning objectives.